I'm sorry, guys. It's not good.
A deeply religious family confronts questions of faith, science, and mortality in That Dragon Cancer, a stirring new release from Numinous Games. That's coming up next on JO42 Reviews. Although it's certainly very common in films, we seldom see games that can say they were inspired by a true story. I was able to think of Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, and that was it. And even that was just the movie tie-in product to a movie that was inspired by a true story. So that alone makes That Dragon Cancer worthy of note. But what this game accomplishes does a lot more and goes a lot deeper than just that observation. While there has been much debate over what constitutes a video game and what constitutes digital art, most players will likely agree that Numinous Games' recent opus will fall on the digital art side of the fence, but it certainly lands close enough to an actual game to make it a worthwhile experience for gamers and non-gamers alike. We'll talk more about the mechanics of That Dragon Cancer in a moment, but first let's talk about the story, its themes, and presentation. Simply put, this is the story of the late Joel Green, son of Ryan and Amy Green, who was diagnosed with a rare form of cancerous tumor when he was 1 year old. The game follows Joel and his parents through a deeply symbolic, surrealist rendition of the final stages of Joel's illness. What's most immediately striking is the game's world, which draws comparisons to the stark vistas of Ingmar Bergman, at once both lush and bleak, majestic and malignant. We join the Green family on a pleasant walk through a forest park where the gorgeous innocence of vibrant colors are sharply undercut by the presence of a single dead, blackened tree that symbolizes the cancer we'd so like to forget. It isn't pervasive or intense, just a single solitary reminder of that darkest and most penetrating of thoughts. Throughout the game, the player controls not one specific character, but rather the game world itself, sometimes manipulating a specific character and other times moving elements of the environment. This sort of new game format for every level technique was common in a lot of lame franchise game tie-ins like The Rocketeer or The Simpsons Bart's Nightmare. These were generally poorly designed throwaway titles where the player would spend an entire level gaining a set of skills that were never used again in the game. Remarkably, this normally infuriating technique works just fine for That Dragon Cancer for two reasons. One, the game was designed by master craftsmen, and two, the intention is to frustrate and infuriate. This might sound strange, but it's not unprecedented. When Harlan Ellison was approached in the 1990s about creating a video game adaptation of his legendary story I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, he initially wanted a game you couldn't win. At the time, this was unheard of. Games had to be won. They had to have a victory state for the player, or else it would leave the player frustrated, which Ellison, himself generally put off by video games, saw as a noble endeavor if ever there was one. Cyberdreams, the developer, convinced him otherwise, and a compromise was reached regarding that game's ending. Now, decades later, That Dragon Cancer realizes the value in Ellison's initial vision. This is a game that you cannot win. There's a climax and resolution to the story, no question about that, but you cannot win this game. As Chuck Palahniuk observed in Fight Club, on a long enough timeline, the survival rate for everyone will drop to 0. So, knowing that, what will you do to make the most of the time you have here? That's the question asked by That Dragon Cancer, one with remarkably nihilistic overtones for a game built around a staunchly spiritual worldview. And of all the themes explored in the game, the Christian religion, faith, and spirituality are the most prominent after cancer itself. The history of religious and spiritual themes in games is convoluted and controversial, to say the least. In the 1980s, Nintendo emerged as the industry leader and established an unusual precedent with their ban on religious themes in video games. The result is that outside of a few unlicensed off-brand companies like Wisdom Tree, there's never really been a great deal of Christian-oriented video games on the market. But like a lot of Christian rock, what little gaming there was aimed at a Christian audience was ultimately just a set of glorified Sunday school lessons, ways of teaching Bible trivia to little kids. That Dragon Cancer, free to explore controversial ideas in the open landscape of the indie market, dives headfirst into religious themes in a fascinating and often deeply disturbing manner. The Greens are strongly Christian people, and their faith is on full display in the game not as a sermon, but rather as a nakedly unnerving question. Throughout the game, as Joel's condition transitions from hopeful to terminal, the metaphorical imagery that swirls around the events goes from being overtly scientific to profoundly spiritual, a transition that shows the Greens not only turning to but profoundly questioning their faith. It's a remarkably candid presentation, one that sees two very devout Christians willing to present their internal struggles in the most undiluted of terms. Such harsh honesty renders the nature of faith not as something soft and soothing, but rather as an almost Nietzschean process of constant overcoming. A side-scrolling action sequence becomes a metaphor not just for the struggle against cancer, but the futility of trying to explain the situation to children. A perusal of messages from people who have battled cancer leaves the player adrift in an ambient sea. One of the problems with the current glut of indie games is that, like a great deal of indie rock, they don't feel like they were done with very much technical proficiency. Games like Sunset or Glitch Hikers give the impression that they were designed by developers who have only a basic understanding of a few fundamentals of game design and have designed within the limitations of that amateur knowledge. To further the musical analogy, it's sort of like hearing three chords on a guitar played by a musician who is barely able to get them out versus those same three chords played by a master virtuoso who is at the top of his game. The presentation is still the same, but the dexterity and the fluidity is immediately obvious. Such is the case with That Dragon Cancer. It is a virtuoso performance by developers that know their craft inside and out and who implement that skill to create game sequences that seem eminently winnable, only to dash your hopes as the challenge escalates. By the end of the game, we are joining the Greens as they carry young Joel into a shimmering golden chapel that is at once a fusion of technology and religious iconography, the malignant fusion of science and faith that has been metastasizing throughout the game, only to confront a chilling final puzzle that has no solution. The scene is strongly reminiscent of Eiko Ishikawa's set design work on Paul Schrader's Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters, and carries with it similar themes of the destruction of innocence and beauty. The reason I'm telling you this is that it is not a spoiler. If you play this game, you will bond with this family. You will come to love this little boy as you push him on the swings and play with him on the playground, and you'll hold out hope that somehow you will find a way to win, because your experience will come to mirror that of the Greens, who continue to hold out hope even as their situation becomes impossibly grim. That is why That Dragon Cancer works. It not only understands the core elements of game design, but implements them to great effect as a means to express ideas on a profound level. That Dragon Cancer is not just a well-made piece of interactive art. It is art that uses gameplay elements to convey a heretofore unexplored and unexpressed level of human emotion. The great yearnings of art built around loss and death are driven by the profound need we all have to convey our feelings to one another, to know that we have conjured in another person a shadow of the agonies we ourselves have experienced. It is in this way that the tribe of humanity helps its grieving carry their burden, and the Greens, with their profoundly penetrating creation, have elevated the expression of that pain into a whole new realm. They have used the frustration one feels playing an impossibly difficult video game to convey the bracing agony of a loved one's illness and death. That is not just an outstanding artistic achievement, but a step forward in how we connect with one another on a human level. In closing, I will say this. Towards the end of his life, legendary film critic Roger Ebert generated profound controversy in the gaming community when he stated that video games, by their very nature, could not be art and never would be. Part of the backlash to his statements were that many gamers were suggesting titles that, if Mr. Ebert would just play, they believed he would reverse his decision. Were he still with us and accepting suggestions, That Dragon Cancer would be mine. Thumbs up. Hey everybody, thank you for watching that video. I hope you enjoyed it. Listen, my channel's going through some really cool evolutions right now, and I want to make you a part of it. Subscribe for future updates, but please also donate to support my channel on patreon.com/JO42. I've set the modest goal of $100 per video, and your contribution will help me continue to bring you really cool content like what you just saw. And of course, there are some links to the side there to help expedite that process. So again, thank you for your time. I look forward to seeing you again. Peace.